On this week's episode, I interview Patty McIlreavy, who's the president and CEO of Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Listen to her background throughout our conversation, and now she's leading a virtual organization, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, at disasterphilanthropy.org. So please enjoy this conversation with Patty. Hey, I want to jump in real quick. Somebody asked me the other day, what does the Corley Company do? Well, we do three things for nonprofits. One, we facilitate meetings, yes, like board retreats where we discuss governance and strategy with all the members of the board. Number two, advise CEOs and help them as they make decisions and implement actions to drive their mission. And then finally, we produce podcasts such as this one, but also for a number of nonprofits to help you get the word out, get your message out. So if you're interested in any of these services, please feel free to reach out to Michael at thecorleycompany.com. Now back to the podcast. On this week's episode of I-501C, the podcast for nonprofit board members, I have the pleasure of actually interviewing a friend. She's become a friend over the years, Patty McIlreavy, who's the president and CEO of Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I was going straight to your website, Patty. I apologize for that. But what a story you have to tell. Tell our listeners. We're going to have a great conversation on leadership today. But before that, can you share with the audience how you came to be the president and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy?
Yeah. So first, Michael, thank you so much for having me on board. It's great. I love the podcast, and it's really good to be part of this. That's such an interesting question, and it's one CEOs get asked all the time. But realistically, it's a really hard question because where does anyone's pathway actually begin, right? And for me, I've been teaching at Georgetown University, graduate students in the School of Foreign Service for a few years. And this was a question I'd always ask, like, well, how do I get to be? Where do I go? How do I move? And my advice has consistently been like, be open to any opportunity. If you have predetermined pathways and expectations for your future, you're going to miss the possibilities. And I really feel that is something, not only advice I give, but something I have primarily done. It's the actual story of my own journey. Because I've taken on roles at different times, not even roles that I necessarily thought I wanted, but that they interested in me, they challenged me, they were guided and aligned to my values, they underpinned by intentional purpose, my global awareness and just my dedication to advocacy and kind of just bringing that together. And CDP's given me a professional home for all of that. I can bring together my decades of working in the humanitarian sphere, both at the operational and the policy level. I can do advocacy with philanthropy to be part of a future where their giving is informed, impactful, and transformative for people we serve. And so it's really just, my journey is one of having worked in different spaces, but all in a sense to kind of come to this point. I remember someone once, I was applying to a job, my prior job at Interaction, and one of my references, he called me and he told me, I told them when they called me for the reference, of course you want Patty. That's exactly where she should be for her next role. And I think that's what you always want, is you want to have it that the people who you're calling upon, the people who are looking at you are like, actually, that's where they see you more than where you want to be in a way. But that is where your path guides you and heads you towards. And I feel in many ways that is me for Center for Disaster Philanthropy, being able to bring those experiences, being able to bring my skills, and really just connecting it into a place where people have the ability to make a difference on that which I've fought for my entire career.
Well, what's fascinating about this, Patty, is you've been all over the world. I mean, this isn't a usual trajectory. So I just think the audience will find this fascinating. Just tell a little bit about what you've done and where you've done it.
I started my career in that linear path with the United States Agency for International Development. And it's interesting, is if you had asked me in grad school, I would have told you USAID was never where I was going to end. I was like, no, that's not my job for me. I'm going to go work for Brookings or somebody else. I'm going to sit and think big thoughts. But, you get out of school and you need to pay the rent, you need to pay for your school debt. So I was like, okay, this will do. I'll take this job. And I got my security clearance. And within about a year a bit of being at the place where I landed, which was kind of a library job. In reality, I got the job because I had worked in the library during graduate school. Truth, you never know where those odd jobs are going to end you. And I got my security clearance and I found out about this office called the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. And I had worked on conflict. That's literally what I studied, international law and organizations. And I was like, wow, I'm going to go work over there. I've got my security clearance. I'm going to get the job over there. So I transitioned to that location, and it's now called the Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. And at that time, and anyone who's watching this who works at BHA or knows BHA now will be amazed, it was 60 people. Now it's thousands, right? But it was a very small office. And unfortunately, our job was to really monitor and maintain and look at humanitarian crises. So again, that linkage for me that I hadn't known existed in terms of what I'd studied. And I was primarily working on Sudan, but the Rwandan genocide broke out while I was there. And I was sent twice out for what they call disaster assist response teams, and basically working and helping bring funds to those who were helping those survivors from the genocide and helping Rwanda rebuild. And that's where I came to like kind of my first aha moment of my career, where I said, what am I doing making all these decisions about millions of dollars when I've got no idea what it means to work in this environment and do what these people are doing? Like, who do I think I am? So I basically let it be known I was looking to move, to get a job. And the International Rescue Committee, they took me on. They're like, okay, and they brought me in, and I worked with them in Rwanda for a couple of years. I thought I was just going to go for like, I'm going to do 6 months, 9 months, the arrogance of youth, and then I'm going to go back to the better paying job. I didn't. I stayed there. And I continued there. And from there, IRC was just an incredibly, incredibly good organization to me. They built my career. They helped me find opportunities. I went from there to Sudan, from Sudan to Tanzania, from Tanzania to Burundi, from Burundi to my next promotion into a position as regional director over the entire Horn and East Africa for IRC. And at that point, I had children, I had a family. I was like, I need something a little different. I don't want to travel quite so much. So I moved into more of a consulting realm based out of Jordan. My husband was working on Iraq at that time. And I then worked primarily for the United Nations on what was then the system, the structure. How do people work within the humanitarian system? So I went from being an operational organization working within the structure to training others in how to work within the structure. And I did that for a few years. And then it was another, again, family decision that we should move back to the global north. And I got a job in Washington, D.C. And on this role, I was literally advising on how does the industry work together. So again, from operations to training, to recognizing where the holes were in the system, to actually influencing how the system structured work and policy. And from there, then transitioned into the CDP. So lots of places, lots of travel, lots of experiences, and just incredibly blessed in both my career trajectory, but also in the amazing people I've gotten to work with along the way, both at country level and in different organizations.
I can't imagine the stories you have, and that is not a usual pathway. That's rather unusual for those. I moved from Tennessee. I mean, that's all I got, right? and you're all over the world, but you continued a little bit in that unusual pathway. And I want to get now into a little bit of leadership and how Center for Disaster Philanthropy operates. You're a totally virtual organization. You inherited a virtual remote organization, and you continue that. So in light of people grappling with should we be remote, should we not be remote, talk a little bit about that. How did you take that over? And then how and why have you continued that approach?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I can't speak to why CDP started as a virtual organization. I have some theories. I think a lot to do with like financial and just the staff who started it, right, and where they were actually located. But I know that today it serves us, it serves our mission. And the way it does that is we can recruit people, the best people with the right skills from across the nation, right? It just gives us incredible flexibility. Our staff can decide where they live and why. And this models the traits we seek in the programs that we fund, right? We want people to be able to have a dignity of choice, agency over their future. And so in some ways, as an organization, keeping that virtual allows us to demonstrate a modeling of behavior for the very thing we seek philanthropy to look at in how they work with grantee partners and communities.
And so, and I love that consistency, the values based approach that's consistent with what how you do your business. But as a leader, what are some of the challenges of having this remote, virtual, or what terminology do you use, organization?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I actually go back and forth. Sometimes I call it dispersed, sometimes I call it virtual, remote. I mean, it really can vary. They're pretty much all the same thing, though we're not together. And leading staff, I mean, one of the biggest challenges I will find inheriting an organization that was already virtual that then went through COVID was we all believed, me less so because I hadn't been virtual before, but there's a strong belief that we knew how to do this. And we didn't, because it's very different to be a small organization who's virtual and a large organization who's virtual. So even the experiences CDP has as an organization of about 30 people is going to be different than an organization of 100, of 500, of 1,000, because the complexities are exponential, right? So definitely what we've done, some of it is valuable, but it's going to be, even harder for some organizations to maintain that. But I think one thing as a leader that we've had to do that I feel has been really important is we have to be much more intentional in creating space for connections and information sharing. And that is, you don't have the privilege of doing that softly. I think if you're doing that in a large organization or even a small organization and you're all together, there's a lot of what you call management by walking around, right? You get a little bit of a sense of what's happening. You could identify problems. You notice a little grumble over here. There's not much space for festering unless you really are isolated from your staff, right? You really do see it. You can have conversations. You can identify it. Virtually, remotely, you have no oversight. Like you're in your little siloed space and they're off in their space, and maybe you're not even in the same time zone. But there's an incredible ability for there to be challenges that get created. And so you have to have a really explicit intentionality in that. And it's hard. I'll be honest. We weren't doing it at the start of my time with CDP. It's been something I've had to learn. It's been something my executive team has had to invest in. It's something as an organization we've all had to share. And one of the things has been a heavy investment in organizational culture and strategic alignment. And it does bring positive results, but it, as I said, it costs. It costs time, it costs money, it costs a lot of energy from leadership, and also a certain amount of grace, both given and taken, because there's always going to be this again. I thought we've discussed it,
Mhm.
And what is it they say? Like 6 times before someone remembers.
Right.
And so there's maybe it's only the 3rd time you've been talking about it with this person, but you've talked about it 8 times with someone else, but you still need to give that person the grace because it's the first, only the 3rd time with them. So it's about finding that balance. And I will say bringing in external support for that has been very valuable. I mean, a shout out to Michael Corley and the Corley Company for helping us with our strategic alignment work. Major assistance, because again, the same thing that remote needs you to build trust. It needs you to build trust in the process. It needs you to get people to be engaged in different ways. And so external partners allow you to do that, allow an additional lean in for that, because leadership is on the same space as everyone else in terms of influence. The other thing with culture is similar. We brought in someone to help us with culture. We're still working with them. We worked with them for over a year very closely, and we continue to work with them. And part of that is not just like, oh, let's get together and these kumbaya moments, which is how some people might think about culture. It's really about common language. What do we mean when we say we're going to act, adjust, and align? What do we mean when we say, being authentic in the conversation meter? What do we mean when we talk about how we're going to work together and what the paradoxes that guide our work may be? These are things that help us across this remote space get into some of those challenges that might come across because we're remote or virtual from each other, but allow us when we are together, be it via Zoom or in person, to have a common narrative, a common approach.
So you do get together sometimes. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I want to even get a little bit granular. How does Patty structure her day? Do you have a bunch of Zoom meetings? Do you intentionally just pop in on people? I don't even know how you would do that. So yeah. So do you get
Yeah.
together, and then how do you have those water cooler conversations with no water cooler present?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say I never pop in on people, but actually that wouldn't be true. I do. But I
Okay.
don't, but they have to answer. So
Right. Yeah.
I knock on their door. So we use Slack, which is an asynchronous tool, but it will on occasion. It's great because I can just, it's, as opposed to a phone call, which might seem a little too invasive, especially generationally, it's different spaces.
Yes.
But it's like, I'm basically knocking via Slack and you can answer or not, and then if I need it, if I want it to be like an immediate call, we just, I can call you or I just drop you a note. And sometimes, you'll have these little huddles as a result, but normally most of my engagement is through planned Zoom calls. That's the majority of it. I keep to regular office hour. I mean, regular one-on-one check-ins with my staff, and then I also with my direct reports, and then I have office hours for all of staff. Once a week, I have an hour that's literally me sitting in a room with my door wide open, and anybody who wants to come can come drop in. And that's a great way. I also do these things called from the CEO desk emails every now and again. If something, just I mean, I give a lot of credit to my staff. They're often just musings. But like, here's something that I've heard or I'm thinking about, or you might be aware of, and just send them communications, a little bit of getting to know you, getting to know me, getting to know where I'm coming from. Um, Other staff have replicated the office hours. Our CFO has drop-in hours. Our director of culture, people and belonging has office hours. So there's different ways that we've and a couple other staff that are like, I want to help you with PowerPoints, or I'd like to help you with your research planning. They've created some office hours. We created a staff advisory group. They have office hours. It makes it sound like, oh my God, all these different office hours, but they're not all every week, and they're optional. You don't have, if you don't have, there are many times I sit by myself for an hour in that room and nobody comes knocking, and that's
And you're
okay.
talking
I
about a
work.
virtual room.
It's a virtual
Yeah.
room. It's a virtual room, and I just do my work, and if it rings the bell if somebody enters the room, and I know to look at the call, and there they are. So we have to do, and I hope you're seeing the theme here, which is it's a lot of intentionality.
That's it. Yes.
It's a lot of intentionality. It's a lot of making that space. But additionally, we've also created physical presence connections. We have executive team meetings once a quarter, usually around our board meeting. We try to do those in person. We have our retreats, rather, not meetings, but we also do. We have funding available for departments to do their own retreats, and they can do those once or twice a year. Some of them prefer to do a mix of hybrid and virtual and in person, but we try to do that. Even with our board, we've now required some of the board meetings to be in person. So it's just trying to say, like, we know that physical contact and connectivity is still critically important, and we've set aside funds for that. But at the same time, we also make a lot of space available to continue to make ourselves accessible through virtual means.
And have you found this to be challenging if I'm a leader and I'm accustomed to being with people and leading people in person, and now it's virtual, are people able to make that transition? Is it a learnable transition? Because this is the future.
I mean, I'll be honest, we've had staff who have joined us because they think that virtual is a solution for challenges they may have in their personal life. And it's not. It's not always the solution. If you've got challenges with home care, or you've got challenges with family dynamics, virtual may not actually be the full solution. So it's definitely. We had one person who left because she just missed being in an office, right? I mean, it's a reality. Some people, it's very hard adjustment, and that's okay. We're okay with the fact that this is a transitional time for the workforce. And we try and do everything we can. We have flexible work hours. We try and, enable this to be an environment that is adaptive as possible to the needs of people, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be like, oh, this resolves all that's ill with the in-person workspace. So one is, even virtual, for those who are seeking virtual, there's a word of caution that it's not guaranteed to be the solution for all things. I also think it's challenging for mentoring, for guiding. I actually really feel for the emerging professionals, because if I think about how much I learned in those first years, I mean, I learned all throughout my career. I mean, you always do. You learn what you want to be, what you don't want to be, right? But it's the access, the ability to recognize that, okay, that leader isn't so scary because I see them having lunch, like whatever it is that humanizes people, but also recognizing those spaces, having fun. That's kind of gone. I mean, think about some of my closest friends I have now that I've had for decades. They're people I worked with. I worked with in an office. I played on the softball team after work with, I mean, whatever it was. So there's definitely a lot of that is lost. And I do feel, especially again for this generation coming into the workforce, that there's a loss here. We don't yet know what it will be. It may not, maybe it's not a loss, maybe it's an opportunity that I can't see yet, but it's a loss from my experience, from how I would envision their future. I also think that for some, such as myself, I mean, I really, like, I love working off people. I'm an extrovert. I get a lot of energy off of those engagements. You know, I mean, it's interesting. Like my CFO, I was going up to an event in DC recently, and she goes, "Oh, you're going to come back all refreshed because you just like." I actually come back like it charges my batteries being with people, and so there's something there that is an adjustment. But then I also think like for some, that's been a drain for their entire life, right? They're like, oh my God, I got to go to an event. So I recognize that this is more in some ways just a balancing and it's more personal for me, but I ensure that I have those opportunities to recharge in the way I need to. And then we seek to, again, create those opportunities and allow that for staff as well, like conferences or events or in person, whatever they may need, we try and create that space.
Two themes are resonating or consistent throughout. The intentionality, and that's an additional burden on a leader that you didn't have to worry about before. Yes, there's probably some positives also, but I love that everything's very intentional. So, leaders out there, you've got to be very intentional on incorporating this remote environment because the adaptive workplace, Patty, you said that adaptive workplace or workspace is kind of the future. And we may not like it, but that's the reality. You seem to be really going with that and have created that's a selling point for working at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy.
I think so. I think it is. I think we've had people who've come, apply to us because of that. And I've had friends who reach out to me to say, do you know any other organizations that have a similar model? I mean, it is being sought more and more, hybrid at the very least, right? And it's not just the commute, though the commute is part of it, right? People are just tired of that. But I think it's also being able to choose where you want to live. And for some, it's because they've got aging parents, so they want to be closer to their parents. For some, it's because they've got young children and they want to be able to like go pick up their children from school every day. And I just think about if I'd had this when my children were younger, how much different I might have been able to adjust in terms of times and space. But it also comes with certain negatives, which is like, what does flexible hours mean? Like, when is an off time? How do you reinforce with staff that like after five is after five, but actually maybe after five isn't after five for you because you took 3 to 4 off, and so like how does that all work? But it's about kind of building that trust in staff to tell them, I'm looking at your output and your performance, not the hours you're clocking. Right. And so that's another difference for leaders is, I mean, we've all had those people, right? Very physically present, but actually not doing a whole lot. Right. And those people, they're going to suffer in the virtual space if they're seen because what are they delivering? But others who perform really well, this is going to work into some ways to their advantage because they're going to be able to not feel trapped to their desk in the same way they would have in a different environment. So I think there's a lot of flexibility that leadership can bring to this that allows the best of staff to come out if you can kind of create that environment to recognize that I'm not watching your every moment, every movement. I'm looking at how are you delivering for the good of the mission and how are you part of where we're going. And that's like really the parameter we're looking at. And that's for us is and creates a greater, I think, a greater dynamic for staff.
Yeah, and I would argue that makes it, you have to be a stronger leader to lead in that type of environment because you're not just looking at the person and checking, making sure they're at their desk. I think that was very, very well stated. Now let's talk a little bit about your board. Your board is remote as well, has been forever because I know they're from all over the world, literally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so how do you manage that? But I also heard you say in our conversation, and I do also know this for a fact, you're bringing them together for at least some type of regularity. So would you talk a little bit about the approach with the board? Because I'm hearing this a lot in my community. People go, "Oh, my board members want to do remote. They just want to Zoom in. They don't want to show up for meetings."
Well, I mean, to be honest, it'd be hard for me if my board was fully zooming in and they were all in the same town. Okay, because that
Fair.
that for me is a lost opportunity. Why not get together? Why not? Because I would say my biggest challenge. So I'll start with the positive. Actually, my board is incredibly supportive, very engaged. They're strong, and and I think it's because I've been able to search all over the world for them. Right? I am able to look for the gaps in our skills. The board is able to engage, and we are able to find those people and bring them on and that's wonderful. Um, However, they don't know each other as well. And I have a lot of touch points with them. Staff have touch points with them. I try at least twice a year to have one-on-ones with each board member, just to check in with them. How's this experience going for them? Are we using their skills, et cetera? I have committees, including my executive committee, my governance nomination committee, that I meet with regularly, right? So I mean, I have different touch points in those group settings with different individual board members, but they with each other is less. And a board to be successful also needs to have that connection with each other to understand each other's skills. Why did you join the board? Why are you on this board, right? And I think about like one of our last board meetings was in person in New York, and not everyone was there, but my God, it was like a party. They were all so happy to be together. They were like making jokes and talking to each other. And I just think like that dynamic is so valuable. And, I think we often, with the remote, it'll be like Zoom, people only want to be on screen for so long. It's tiring. It's a lot of work to look at a screen. But when you're in person, for most, you can just kind of relax a little bit. It can take, that we can kind of have a conversation, have a chat over lunch, walk out to get a coffee together, whatever it may be. And those connections are just gold. In terms of people really feeling a connection. And so we have a structure now where we do 2 fully virtual, 1 hybrid and 1 in person a year. And I'll be honest, the in-person is kind of a lie. We still let people call in, but we really encourage them to come in person. We provide funding if they don't have funding to come in person. It's hosted by a board member. So there's that whole thing of like, hey, come celebrate and be supportive of your board member who's hosting. So there's different ways that we kind of move it forward. And our next board meeting is in December in Florida. And I think we almost have, almost everyone there except for 1 or 2 people that just logistically, there was a challenge that came up at the end for them. And it's great because we're making the most of them being in person. We're having a governance training the day before, we're having a dinner the night before, and then we're having a volunteer event after the board meeting. So we have like 4 different touch points for them to talk to each other, to get to know each other. Executive team members will be there for some of it, we'll be there for the board meeting and the dinner and the volunteer event, but they have only themselves for governance. So it's just ways for them to continue to grow those connections, to brainstorm who else should be on the board, what are the skills we're missing. And that's where I just find it, it's, I think leaders underestimate how much work a good board is to make and how important it is to keep. Right? It'd be very easy for me as a CEO to just kind of, okay, I talk to the board once every quarter, or I let them know once a month what's happening. But when I think about the incredible value my board brings to my work, to my team's work, to our mission, to the places they introduce us into, I mean, there's always more we can do, of course, but the value they bring us, it is really just worth its weight in gold. And even just acting as mentors to me and things we're thinking through, knowing very clearly the difference between management and governance, but being willing to be a mentor on the management because of their own experiences. Those are just things that I find so incredibly valuable. But again, intentionality, same theme. You just have to make those meetings. You have to set them up. You have to have them agended. You have to prepare for them. And it takes effort, but it's worth it.
Yeah, intentionality takes time and effort. I like that. That could even be a bumper sticker emerging from this podcast. So let me ask you this. I'm sure a lot of executive directors, CEOs are listening to this. Have you found that there's been any negative impact or positive impact from funders understanding that you're a remote or virtual organization? Does it make one iota of difference?
No. The simple answer is I don't think so. I mean, we're privileged to work with funders who have trust and confidence in CDP and our mission, and we're not place-based. So I can see why for some it might make a difference. Okay, we're based out of, Austin, Texas, and our funders are all based out of Austin, Texas, but all of our staff are based out of New York. There might be some like, what? Like you're not really from the community, right? So I think I can see how in some models it could be a challenge. But for CDP, we are global, national and global, right? And so the fact that our team are all over doesn't seem to be a challenge. They understand and support the value of our work. They have a shared vision They buy into our mission. And so they, to help communities withstand disasters equitably when they occur. And so that's kind of what they take away, not where you locate it. And there's been an additional thing that's come up, and I've heard it more recently because of my recent move to Florida, is there are donors who actually appreciate that staff not only have the skill set of having worked into disasters and response and operationally and understand the mechanisms, but who themselves are among disaster affected communities, who work within and alongside places where cyclical disasters occur. And that in some ways that brings us an introduction into a narrative that's kind of different from here we are as the experts telling you from afar, but it's also here we are as people alongside those who are affected telling you how my community has been impacted. And so I think there's a lot of value that comes out as well with donors, not with all, but with some who are looking for that messaging. I think it's definitely I've heard it more again since I've moved to Florida and we've had the recent hurricanes and people really recognizing, hey, how are you doing? Everything okay? And kind of connecting with that in a way that we hadn't before.
And while we love to have you here, Patty, you're more than welcome to move back in light of the fact that the irony here to the listeners, and I did share this with Patty, the head of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy moves to our coast in Florida, and we have 3 hurricanes. Just bam, 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 bam.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I thought,
know.
wow, how about that? Love you, Patty, but you can go back.
I know it gives my career path a whole different,
Yes, it does.
I got like Spain to do, but no. It is interesting, but I think, that really ties, Michael, to, the fact that disasters are coming for us, more and more in places we never expected them. Look at, people of Asheville, North Carolina, and all across North Carolina, that crisis that was pretty much was seen as a climate haven. We had a webinar recently, and one of the gentlemen was talking about he's 6th generation Appalachia, and he's like, there hasn't been a flood like this since Noah. And I think that's where we need to recognize that what's coming in terms of extreme weather events is going to surprise us all in many ways. And we all need to start getting prepared for that mindset and looking at what we can do to mitigate the vulnerabilities that exist for the communities and the people we care about, and also to explore how we can mitigate the impact that those events will have when they arrive. And that's where, that's just that intersection, is obviously where CDP spends a huge amount of its time, but it's also in recognizing that there are less and less safe places to be. And instead, we need to be talking more about how do we prepare that people are safe? How do we prepare that, infrastructure is safe? Instead of thinking that somehow it's about mass movements of populations that are going to resolve our exposure to extreme weather events.
And I've heard you say, and this is a really nice segue into my next question, every funder is a disaster funder in some sort, form, fashion, or another, even though they may say, I'm in childcare, I'm in, you pick it, right? But I assume in Asheville, all of a sudden, everybody's a disaster funder in some respect,
right?
Even along our coast. Would you just address that a little bit, that every funder is a disaster funder?
Yeah. So, in the past, I think when we looked at disaster philanthropy and, CDP was themselves guilty of this, we were like, we have this tent of people who believe in this one idea, this space. And I think what we've had to do is say, actually, no, that's wrong. Everyone is a disaster funder. And the whether you call yourself that or not really doesn't matter to me, because what matters is the people we're serving. And they are not looking at your mission, your mandate, your silo, whatever you might call your different sectors you work in. They're looking at, are you there for me in the way that you've promised to be there for me, in the way that you've, said you are there for me? And so you're looking at whatever it may be, your sector, maybe it's racial justice, maybe it's education, maybe it's childcare, like you said, maybe it's health. But if you're staying only at a space where it's like, okay, here I am in this general area and everything's working well and I'm going to invest and double down on it, and then you're not seeing the vulnerabilities, or you're not addressing the vulnerabilities of that community really effectively, or even if you are, this extreme event comes, whatever it may be, that's your Achilles heel. That's going to wipe out your progress. And you don't have to believe me, just look at COVID. Look at every program across this country, across the world, and how COVID just basically shut it down. And that's what we need to be prepared for. We had education systems all over this country saying they couldn't support virtual. They couldn't address the needs of children who needed different types of environments. They couldn't, no, 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 no. And wow, within a month, wow, we could figure it out. But then what did we do after COVID? We went right back to where we were. So I think this is where we need to be adaptable. We have to recognize that vulnerabilities, the systemic vulnerabilities that our programs are addressing, aren't going to be fixed if we don't open up our aperture enough to see the threats that are coming. The threats that are coming for the people we care about. And that's where I'm not saying every organization needs to transition into how do I become a disaster organization? How do I do operational work? It's more just seeing it and finding partners, looking for collaborations, training nonprofits, whatever it may be, giving that stability to organizations to know that you're going to be there for them if there's a road bump that comes for them. These are things that when I talk about everyone's a disaster philanthropist, it's about look at the equity in your community, look at the situations that they're vulnerable to, and really explore how can you position yourself as a donor to help them weather those storms when they come. Or better yet, mitigate them from actually affecting that community. We've seen this, right? People that get rental assistance in advance of a storm, right? They come out of the storm better. There's ways that we can give assistance that actually allows communities to mitigate the impact because they're able to use their resources differently. They're able to make their decisions with better planning. They're not going into emergency mode. They're able to think differently. And those are things which I think the community is getting better at, the funding community, but it is something we constantly need to be working at because the stronger communities are to withstand and recover from natural hazards and humanitarian crises, the better we're going to be as a global community.
Once again, demonstrating adaptability and intentionality, even in your work. And I've heard you give that talk a number of times, Patty, and you're just absolutely transforming the world we live in, and really, really grateful for that, and grateful for the work that everybody at CDP is doing. So, Patty McIlreavy, any last parting words for our listeners?
I just think it's really just if you center communities, if you think about, all they want is what we can help them with. And they want to do that with agency over their choices, with the dignity we can provide them. And that's where for a lot of us, it's about, we've seen this with the various crises and disasters that have been occurring over the last months, even just across the United States. We all want to rush in with the assistance we think people need. And I think for CDP, what we kind of constantly advocate for is breathe. Give it a minute. Let the community take a beat. Not to say you don't give out some immediate assistance. Of course, if they need water, give water. I'm not saying that. But give a moment to allow them to lead in their recovery. And listen to what they have to say. Because even I, as an expert with 30 years of experience in this sector, every day I learn about something new that I wouldn't have thought of because I'm not from that community. And so I think it's about recognizing that we don't have all the answers and we don't need to have all the answers and we don't need to save everyone. We just need to be helping hand for those who are reaching for it.
Oh, well stated. Patty McIlreavy, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Thank you for joining the I-501CU podcast for nonprofit board members.
Thank you for being.
All right, we just finished listening to interviewing Patty, and now this is Recapping with Reed. Reed's observations. Reed, your first observation.
My first observation is the positives and negatives of having a remote board. Some of the positives, Patty gets to select board members from all across the world, people that she thinks will be the best fit for their organization. Some of the negatives being more like the board members don't know each other. You have to be very intentional when it comes to creating space for them to get to know each other better.
Yeah, absolutely. And number two?
Number two is kind of Patty's take on her career and just a general philosophy of keeping doors open. You never know what's going to approach you and what direction you're going to take.
Yeah, that's true. And she's been all over the world just based on following her career. Quite impressive. And number three?
When it comes to a remote work environment, you do need to be extremely intentional with organizational culture and strategic alignment across the entire organization.
Yes, and that is not easy. And just listening to her talk, I thought, oh my gosh, the amount of effort that takes. It's additional effort on you leaders out there. So, but it pays off in spades, as you heard from Patty. So there you have it, recapping with Reed. And we will I-50 and see you next week.